A successful business is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just saying, here's my traction mix, why isn't it making money? There's so much that goes into it.
Hi, I'm Russ.
And I'm Danny.
And this is the Memory Makers Podcast.
The show that helps you create amazing customer experiences and make more memories.
Pow, 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 pow. I just felt like we were bringing back a classic, because why not?
I like it.
What's up, brother?
Well, with me, just a lot of the same old, but with you've been a road warrior recently.
I'm racking up those frequent flyer miles, baby. That was.
Yeah.
I just got done with Foundations last week, which was incredible, and shout out to Jerry and all of his great work into that event. Ended up visiting 14 sites while I was in Texas. So hit up San Antonio, hit up Austin, hit up some stuff in Dallas and some things in between, and was really, really wonderful to get to do that many. I don't know if I'd recommend doing that many sites in a day and a half because it was a little bit of a whirlwind, but it was highly, highly valuable. But you know me, sometimes I struggle to pace myself. So, but I was just absolutely blown away. One, always being able to keep your finger on the pulse by getting to see that many folks, one, at Foundations and some of the operators that were there, but also just being out in the wild, seeing what's working for folks and things that they're experimenting with. I'll tell you, side note early, we can go down this another day, but some of the cool new service robots that I saw a couple of locations that had these things, and you want to talk about something that just gets rid of the slough work that's wasteful for your paid staff to do. Holy cow, really, really, really neat. And it got me thinking as I was flying home, just how cool that is and how different it was, and some of the, talking with the operators and what some of their initial questions were and how they kind of vetted that. And then it got me thinking a little bit more of just how do we balance this evolution versus revolution, right? We see Back to the Future back in the day, and we want to, expect we're going to have flying cars, in the next 5 years. And it takes a lot longer to get there. But, we in our industry see constant, innovation and change, but there's this real struggle because it's a calculated risk a lot of times of, hey, if I want to put this in my center, and how am I weighing these decisions? How am I making the right choice for me and my location and my market in order to make sure that this is going to be a fruitful investment? So I thought what we do in today's episode is kind of break down some frameworks and some good criteria questions that would not only we as manufacturers use when we're innovating new products, but a lot of our customers need to use as well when they're thinking of, hey, I've only got so much square footage, I've only got so much budget, I need to make an impact. How do I set myself up to be in the best position possible to make a good decision for that execution? So, when we start with some of this, some of the initial questions that I was talking with some of the operators with were, we want something new and unique, right? Like when I'm meeting with these folks on the site blitz tour, it was, hey, what's new? What's fresh? And while all of that is good and we want to keep our finger on the pulse, not everything is a Cinderella, it's a Cinderella slipper sometimes where it's not going to be a perfect fit for everyone. And so I tend to ask, more questions of, well, what are you guys looking for? What audience, are you trying to attract? How are you guys feeling about your current staff? Because there are some new things that are great and awesome and easy, like the robots and hey, this is takes up 2 square feet of space in my kitchen area and can clean and bust tables and, take out the trash. But then there are other things that it's like, oh, should I be going down the road of full tilt, free roam, arena-sized VR? It just kind of depends on what you're set up for, what you're trying to do. But the first, I always come back to this because we've talked about it at 360 a couple of times, is in addition to some of that, it's what's your tolerance for risk, I always go back to this Rogers adoption curve that we've come across where it talks about, you've got this early set of innovators, which makes up about 2.5% of the general population. Then you start to move into the visionaries, which is about 13.5% of the population. Then you get into these pragmatists and early majority, which makes up about 34%. Then you get this other half of the main part of the bell curve of the late majority or conservatives that need to see it proven out before they're really going to take the leap. Another 34% there. And then the skeptics, the tail end of that bell curve being about 16%. And so that's the first question too that I always want to ask folks. It's like you want the latest and greatest, but how are you evaluating things from a risk perspective? Are you getting the brand new phone that you know are going to have some bugs and features in the software that need to get worked out, or are you someone that's like, nope, I'm on my iPhone 6 still because I don't trust big tech or whatever that ends up looking like. But not only do you need to understand where you fall as an individual operator, but where does the rest of my leadership team fall on that? And where do even folks like the banks that I work with, how do they interpret some of these things from a risk assessment standpoint? So those tend to be the first two pieces: is what's your risk tolerance? Where do you typically find yourselves falling on that kind of adoption curve? And what are some of the intentional specific results you're trying to achieve? Is it a new market? Is it just being fresh? Is it competing with somebody down the street? Because there will be different fits depending on where those answers fall.
Once you understand kind of your own risk tolerance, we can take a step back. And part of the reason you need to identify risk tolerance is because there is very rarely a sure thing when it comes to new technology.
Yeah.
It's sometimes hard to navigate because we've seen things fail that felt like sure things. And we've seen other things that were maybe a lot of people were questioning it and weren't really sure, that ended up being successful. And so there's no guaranteed check these 3 boxes and you'll be successful for sure. But we want to start giving you a couple examples of successes and failures among product categories. And then we're going to give you some additional kind of frameworks to think about as you move forward. But one of the first ones that comes to mind, because it's top of mind for a lot of people right now, is VR. But I don't mean the current sense of VR. I mean the first phase back, in the 90s. And there was a ton of hype and people really excited, but it very quickly failed. And it failed in a very big way. Mm-hmm. And part of it was because the throughput and capacity did not support the costs. The costs were really high. The throughput was low. The throughput and capacity were low, and the ability to charge for that experience, it didn't all add up and it didn't work. And so that failed. And then about 8 years ago, there was a new resurgence of VR. And when that first started, rightfully so, a lot of people had the same questions of like, is this going to happen again? Is this going to be just a repeat of what we saw back, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And it ended up, the answer to that was no, it was not a repeat. And it's had a much greater staying power. And a lot of that is because the technology is dramatically improved. The costs have gone down significantly. There are so many different kinds of operational models that are available right now. You can look and people will use different kind of buckets and terminology for this. We like to use kind of pretty simple ones of there's very small footprint arcade VR. And then there's kind of that hybrid attraction where it's, not a huge amount of space, a couple hundred square feet. And then you also have giant free roam and you have motion simulators. You have VR that's available in a lot of different capacities. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of in its next growth spurt of finding its new way forward and really expanding into those new free roam operational models. And so it's just interesting seeing how that was something that was both. It was at first a failure and now it is succeeding. So it's interesting to be able to kind of look at the past and understand how we got to where we are.
Well, and it's to your point as well, right? You have to have all of those things gel, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there are certain aspects of, dedicated standalone centers that are going to try things. And then, they'll be successful with it. And then, okay, how do we adopt that into a mixed entertainment, ecosystem like our traditional FECs and location-based entertainment and all of that fun stuff, as well as, okay, operationally, what's that going to look like? To your point, all the different styles of VR that we're starting to see now are coming because the manufacturers are understanding, hey, not everybody wants to have a full 2,000 square foot, 3,000 square foot free roam VR piece. We are more geared, we want to offer something that's a high fidelity and high value perception piece to our guests, but Rabbids is crushing it for us, and that allows us to scratch that itch. And so it's really fun to see things come into their own as you continue to see growth and development. And another example that we see, is something like esports, right? I mean, gosh, and taking it from us where we, thought that there was a lot of value and still like the right type of operator can do esports very well, but it didn't get the mass adoption because there were things from an operational side where, hey, it takes a lot of staffing and effort and energy to build and nurture a community that you're going to get folks to come back to as this home base and do all of this. But esports was so popular and everyone was so jazzed on it that if you were doing any sort of tournament style play on any type of arcade game, it was getting slapped with the esports buzzword on it because it was just so hot. But it very limitedly reflected what traditional esports were. And so I think that there's, things that we as manufacturers look at as well of, okay, what's it going to take to make this translate into a family entertainment or a mixed entertainment, type of a venue that is going to then be executable by the staff consistently. And not all of those things are created equally. And there are some folks that are absolutely slaying it still with esports and have a huge drive, but those folks are doing much more targeted programming and niche offerings, really helping bring that stuff along. Not everybody has the willingness or the tolerance for that. We have some operators that say, hey, I prefer a little bit more of the crock pot kind of a thing where I can put this in, it's going to perform well, their tolerance level for what it's going to take to make that successful and the operational requirements are different. So that was a key example of some folks do really, really well with it and lean into it and have a fantastic result with it and slay it with the birthday parties. And then other folks, it was just not their cup of tea, right? It just didn't lean into their love language or what they were set up to do at the moment. And so they moved on from it. But then we also see that with other things like escape rooms. And we've seen a wide variety of that with the escape rooms, Danny, as far as what the initial perception was and, then how it's actually translated really successfully into FECs.
Yeah, escape rooms had a lot of skepticism at first for a couple reasons. One, a lot of it came out of kind of that haunt industry, and there's a lot of separation between location-based entertainment / FEC world and the haunt world. They're kind of like two different playgrounds, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it came out of that world, but also there was a lot of people didn't fully understand if it would be able to be adopted into an FEC environment. Where would they be able to charge enough, or would they be able to charge that amount that standalone locations were charging? And did it make sense to have somebody in one of the profit centers for a full hour? And so at first there was a lot of that skepticism. And then beyond the skepticism, just like with anything, when escape rooms first started coming into the FEC world, it took a little time to get traction because some of the very first ones weren't as successful as the ones that are being developed now. Technology came along, better integration with, PLC boards and software, and all the things that go with that. But when we now look at where escape rooms are, it's not a thing that every FEC has them because it doesn't make sense for every FEC. Mm-hmm. Again, it's about their operational model. But as the concept has been proven out by more FEC and LBE operators, and as the escape rooms themselves and the offerings have improved, and as the timing options have also changed. There are 60-minute rooms, there are 30-minute rooms, there are some even as short as 15-minute rooms that allow people to find what makes sense for their operational model. They don't necessarily have to have a 60-minute experience that they're charging $30 or $35 a person. There's other ways to do that. And so it's interesting seeing how something that started as a very skeptical, people who were thinking this is never going to actually work in FECs, is being very successful in a lot of entertainment venues now because the operational models have been formed and adopted around that. And there's been a willingness from customers and a desire from customers to have that experience and pay for that experience. And, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the difference between a standalone center and a multi-entertainment FEC environment is when you have an FEC and someone comes in for escape rooms, you have so much more that you can offer them in that visit and return visits than a standalone escape room center can have.
Mm-hmm. And all of this, these are just some of the different highlights. I mean, and we've had things where, gosh, we had Color Crush, right? That was a 10-foot wide little, touch panel, quick arcade piece that did okay, but then eventually newer and better things kind of surpass it. And so we, on the manufacturing side, go through a lot of this of, okay, yes, this works within this environment, but then how do we get it to, is it only going to work for this small percentage of people? And, if that's what it's going to be, okay, great. We need to then be able to charge appropriately for that, for the attraction itself. But then that in turn can put a burden on folks to, that are buying it of, okay, well, if it's more expensive because only a few of us are going to actually be doing it, then how do we start to, have that same mentality translate to the guests, right? How are we going to get the guests on board and actually have a lot of fun with this? So, this starts to get into this main section of what's the criteria and the framework that I as an operator want to have when we're evaluating these new attractions. And so first, I encourage everyone, go back to that Rogers adoption curve. Where do I fall as an individual? As far as innovator and visionary, are we really, getting after it on the cutting edge, tip of the spear kind of an approach with it? And do we have a proven track record of being able to execute those kinds of things? Do we have a good enough team on board to ask more detailed questions, to really peel back all the layers of the onion, as it were, in order to kind of learn the black and the white by living in the gray? Or do we as a team fall a little bit more into that early or late majority where we need to see it proven out? We need to see what others are doing in a like-minded setting, so that way we can take that ball and run with it even further. And so knowing yourself and having that, kind of honest assessment of what is it going to take, for us, and how do we take these things on as a group, is really helpful in that first piece, because that so much of it can come down to, hey, it can have all the potential in the world, right? We talk about don't buy a Ferrari just to deliver pizzas with it. And it's one of those, hey, if we're going to buy something, we're going to put the investment into it, how are we making sure that we've got the right drivers to be able to create a really cool guest experience that's going to translate for them?
I will tease an upcoming episode of our podcast that will be coming soon. We have an operator interview that you're doing, and it's all about being an early adopter of technology in the FEC space. And I'm really excited for that. It'll be out in a couple of weeks. So keep your eyes out for that, anyone who's listening to this episode.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one.
There's a line that I'm going to drop in here, because if I don't say this, I think you'll be mad at me. I've seen the wow, now show me the how.
Yes.
It was one that you heard recently and immediately clicked with you, and you said, I'm using this all the time now.
It was like Inception. I can't get it out of my brain right now. I mean, and it's true. Like, it's so easy to get caught up in the razzle dazzle, but it's like, well, okay, laws of physics, logistics, all of those kinds of things still get to have their say. So how do we actually make this thing start to translate?
So this really comes down to, it's one thing to say that, attraction, I want to feel like I'm an early adopter or I'm early majority, I'm going to put this in. It's one thing to say, make the decision to put it in your center. It's another to be able to commit the resources and effort to make that thing successful. Because, the idea of if you build it, they will come, almost never happens.
Sorry, doesn't. Kevin Costner.
and the idea of set it and forget it also rarely happens, especially if it's going to be something that is further ahead on that adoption curve. It will likely take, not always, likely take a little bit more time and attention than a well-seasoned attraction that's been out for a really, really long time, that you're more of the late majority or on that piece. And so it's important to remember, if you want to add something, you've got to be able to put in the resources to make it successful. When you think about your center, what are the kinds of people that you have on staff? How much staff do you have? Do you have the ability to be able to put the right people on that attraction for the right amount of time in order to make that operationally successful? Here's a very perfect example and I've talked about this before on other podcast episodes and in other presentations, and it bears repeating, is that I will see very often, VR is a great example of this, a hybrid attraction, a 4-player VR setup that does require an operator in order for it to run. And someone will put up a sign that says, see us at the front counter to play. Mm-hmm. You are dooming that to be a failure. Yeah. Because you're putting all of the friction and all of the onus on the guest. And what you're telling them is, it's not worth our time to operate, so it's not worth your time to play.
Mm.
And so if you have an attraction that does require the right amount of staff and intentionality, and you don't put that staff on there, you are going to limit the amount of money that you can make. And I know that there's concerns about how much labor costs and finding good people to be able to work. That same concern has been around since long before COVID was ever a thing,
Mm.
right? I know that in some ways it feels a little bit more, the dials have been turned up to 11, so to speak, and it's a little bit more acute in how we can feel that. But it's not a new thing that we're experiencing. And if
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to add the right staff onto attractions in order for it to be successful, then it's not going to be successful. Another way I like to think about this that just came to mind is think about this in the like delegation.
Mm.
I've seen this before, and it's happened to me before. And so maybe some of you will resonate with this. You are a leader and you have some project or task that it's you need to delegate. You don't really want to, but because you want to hold on to it, and maybe you're afraid about delegating it, whatever it is. So you do end up delegating it to another person, but you don't give them the context or tools or freedom to actually be successful with it, and you don't give them enough time to get through the growing pains to be successful. And then you watch it fail, which subconsciously deep down it'll do, and you use that as your excuse to take it back. Don't do that same thing with an attraction. Don't set it up to fail from the beginning. We want to be able to have the right team in place in order for it to be operated correctly. And another thing that Russ and I were talking about as we were preparing for this episode that I think is so fascinating is when we're talking about these attractions, we also want to think about who else has done this. Not only do we need the right tools to be successful, but we need to look at the other operators who have been successful and what are the things that they're doing right in order for this to do well in their venue. And very often, which is so interesting, on the very early adopters of technology and new attractions and new experiences, so often these experiences will first find themselves in standalone venues before then getting integrated into kind of a multi-entertainment location-based entertainment center.
Yeah.
So a couple examples of how this is worked in the past is we look at something like escape rooms. Escape rooms started in the US as standalone escape room venues, and that's all they had. And then over time, they got integrated into FECs. And then you've got something like axe throwing. Axe throwing started as standalone axe throwing venues, and now it's being integrated into more FECs. And then esports is also another example. There aren't as many centers doing that as something like escape rooms or axe throwing, but it started as kind of standalone gaming esports centers that some people integrated then into an overall FEC. So it's also important about learning from others and finding where other people have also been successful.
And I think that helps highlight what's the true cost of ownership, right? By learning and seeing that, and we even from the manufacturer's side learn that, right? It's know the rules so you can break them properly. To quote Gandhi or the Dalai Lama, I always misconstrue those two, but that's one of those pieces where it's what are some of the common pitfalls that these folks have gone through. And did the successes that they're having work because it's a standalone center, or does it work because they've gotten the reps in and they figured out how to fine tune the process a little bit more? And so if you are in that more early end of the adoption curve with it, looking to those standalone centers, okay, what's going well? Where's the friction or the potential friction in an experience like this? How do we overcome that, when it's getting brought into our own portfolio? And not just taking the manufacturer or the developer's word for, okay, well, we have all of these, here's it's going to be a massive success. It's going to be a massive success. I always joke when I talk with Jeff Gebhardt from 5-Star, and we always have a really good, candid relationship because he'll always tell me, it's like, well, I hate to ask a barber if I need a haircut, Russ. And it's like, but he's, joking with me because he knows, like, I'll say something. It's like, I don't think that this is for you. If I'm looking at what you guys really lean into and do, some things are going to be a really good fit, other things not so much. And so looking at what then do the manufacturers and the developers that you're working with these products, who can they point you to as far as proven entities that have had success with it, and going to those folks and continuing to cultivate and ask questions and see it, right? Like actually get eyes on where some of that is. And And sometimes that can be super frustrating when you have this product that, we've seen that's like, gosh, this really has the goods, but you need a larger, data sample size in order to really prove out how that's going to work in a variety of different ways. But do your manufacturers, are they able to provide you with a variety? Like, hey, this is how it works when you're charging it, as a bundled package attraction and a premium upsell. This is how it works when you put it on free play. This is how it works when you're putting it on, kind of an a la carte pricing model. Like, you need to see where and how that thing is being successful in a variety of different ways. And really get your red flag up if you can't get some proven case studies and client referrals that come around with some of that stuff, because otherwise, and to our point of the upcoming one, if you don't have a high tolerance of being able to figure that stuff out, you're going to be paying a guinea pig tax that is going to feel a lot more grating to you if that's not how you typically approach things.
One thing that struck my mind as you were just mentioning that is any successful FEC, LBE, whatever acronym, because there's so many that you want to use.
Alphabet soup, baby.
Is so much more than an attraction mix. Mm-hmm. You can look at two centers and say, well, they have these 5 attractions and they're really successful. This other center has the same 5 attractions, but they're not doing very well, because a successful business is more than a sum of its parts. It's not just saying, here's my attraction mix, why isn't it making money? There's so much that goes into it. It's what is your demographic? How densely populated is your area? What is your pricing? What is your packaging? What are your positioning pieces? How do you operate? Does your staff feel like they're empowered to be able to create great experiences for people? What is your leadership like? There's so many things that go into it. It's not just saying, well, look, I put together these parts, make me money. There's a lot more that goes into it than that.
Yeah. And that really comes down to how do I define this as a success? Right? It's am I looking for the next golden goose that's just going to print me money and I never have to touch it? Well, is that a realistic expectation to have with these things? Am I going to look at this of, hey, I don't need this to be automatically the number one earner for me, but I'm using it as a way where it can, positively increase dwell time. It can have a positive impact on my food and beverage or other profit centers within the space. How do I see this impacting the frequency? Is it going to be something that they want to come back and do again? Is it a one and done type of a piece? So that way we're looking at it from a per cap spending, a frequency, of visits, as well as dwell time while they're there. How is that playing in the overall mix of what we're doing? Or do I look at this, there are certain pieces where, hey, it's something that we can have a lot of razzle dazzle and pizzazz. But we know that it's not going to be something that you're going to have this diehard cult following that goes along with it. Okay, great. And as well, what's the customer expectation, right? I always bring up this like craft beer renaissance that we've had over the last 10 years. And, back in the day when we were uncultured and uneducated Americans and we just thought, Bud Light and Miller Lite was the only thing that was out there. Nothing wrong with those two. They're perfectly fine options to be able to do. But then now, you have a huge adoption of these craft breweries and everything else that come on where we've refined the palate and we've seen, more of a buy-in. What are you doing in order to get this thing bought in from your customer's perspective, from a what does success look like? How much heavy lifting are we going to do on the front end to get it? And VR was one of those similar things. Do I need it to be a powerhouse revenue? Is it a little bit of a niche offering? What's that mass appeal versus, really focused, a dedicated, loyal customer that's going to come back to it again and again? How does that fit with the rest of the balance of what I've already got? And so, really having an understanding of what that success needs to look like based on how much does it cost, how much square footage, what's the opportunity cost of doing this versus something else. It's what makes everything more difficult to be a 100% prognosticator. It's why there aren't, there's no Nostradamus out there who's had the magic wand for everything that happens, because there are so many variables that can come into place. But it really, to our point, comes back down to what's my risk tolerance? How do I, what is my team's ability to take on new things? What are the proven entities where it's out in the market already? Are there correlation versus causation factors that are making that successful versus what's going to work for us? And really, what's the true cost of ownership, for this in order for this to be a successful piece for us?
I don't really have anything else to add. I think that's a good place to wrap that up.
Mic drop. That's how we do, baby. I love it. I think, this is one of those things that I'm super excited for our upcoming episode that we've got, and I'll tease it now. It's John Lucido with Sun Valley Lanes, who has done such a phenomenal job of taking on new things and what he looks at, what has worked for him, and not. But there's individual single center operators. There's large operators like, Stars and Strikes with, over a dozen locations, that everybody goes through these different things of finding what's right for them. And so that's why we want to continue to build on how you guys can hone in your spidey sense of what's going to be really impactful for you.
If you like what you heard today, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
And we always appreciate that 5 stars. Please and thank you.
If you've got ideas for future episodes, whether that's topics or guests like John Lucido, follow us on social media and send us a DM.
And as always, big shout out to Mikey Mike on the 1s and 2s, working that Ultranet for us. And thank you all so much for joining us. And we will catch you on the next one, Troublemakers.
When you were talking about esports and how so many people were slapping that label on because it's so hot right now, and I was like, that Hansel is so hot right now, is all I wanted to say.
Hansel is so hot right now.
That Hansel is...
And then the other thing is when you said the razzle dazzle and pizzazz, I really wanted to say razzle dazzle and pizzazzle because it just rhymes and it sounds fun.
My mind was going to Chicago.
Give them the old razzle dazzle.
Razzle dazzle. That's where our peanut butter cup comes together, baby.
Positive energy.
Positive energy. All right, Mikey Mike, I'm ready if you are, my friend.